Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 48 of the Nurtured by Nature podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be joined in conversation by Osprey, author of the recently published book, The Story is in Our Bones: How Worldviews and Climate Justice Can Remake a World in Crisis, and founder of the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network. As Einstein famously stated, we can't solve a problem with the same mind that created it, and in this deeply thought-provoking conversation and through her book, Osprey gently encourages us to reflect on our society and to travel back upstream to consider the dominant worldviews of our time and how they have evolved to lead our society to the place where we now stand, surrounded by multiple interlocking crises. It is a conversation and journey that requires us to come with courage and open minds and hearts, but that is critical in ensuring that as the world we know begins to unravel, we equip ourselves with a new mind, set free of the dominant worldviews of dominion over land and nature, patriarchy, colonialism, and racism that have created the challenges we must now resolve. What soon becomes clear from Osprey's life work supporting and advocating for the rights of Indigenous peoples around the world is that change is already taking place, and there are incredible and courageous people who hold and are creating the blueprint of a vision for a different worldview, which is already helping to create encouraging changes through powerful initiatives like Rights for Nature. Osprey shares many stories of the brave women who have stood up to large corporations and governments around the world to protect the natural world and their ancestral lands, beliefs and sovereignty, ultimately for the benefit of all of us, as 80% of all the biodiversity left on Earth is currently stewarded by Indigenous peoples on Indigenous lands. To all of you who have braved punishment and persecution and have been the new mind we need to solve our problems, I dedicate this episode to you with my heartfelt thanks for your courage and determination in the face of adversity. I hope this message encourages others to use our voices in support of your wisdom as we remember our role as a keystone species under whose stewardship nature can thrive. Thank you for all you have done and all you continue to do. Welcome, Osprey, and thank you so much for joining us today on this episode of the Nurtured by Nature podcast. I'm really looking forward to talking to you today, and we're going to be discussing some of the themes and aspects from your lovely new book that you've released. But just to get us started, I always just ask my guests to share a little bit about their nature story and just really how nature has been a part of their life and if that relationship has evolved over time. So if there's something you'd like to share to get us started, that'd be lovely.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me on your podcast. First of all, it's really a pleasure to be here with you and have this conversation. Gosh, there's just so much to say because we could probably take an hour just talking about a relationship. But what comes to mind right now is a deep relationship I've always had with the redwood forests here in California.
Oh, beautiful.
I grew up in Mendocino, the town of Mendocino, which is about 3.5, 4 hours north of San Francisco. And on the northern coast, we have the big redwood trees.
Yeah.
And the beauty of that is that they are so magnificent. They're the tallest trees in the world, and their ecosystem is so unique and special. And at the same time, it comes with grief because also there's only about 4% left
Oh,
of
wow.
the original redwood forests because of, extractive economies and, the way modern people have treated nature.
Yeah.
And so, it's been a great source of joy and healing to walk in the redwood forest, to listen to them as teachers and mentors, but also to realize that they really need our protection. And actually, one of the ways I got into the work I do now is because of seeing huge clear-cut forests in my youth
Yeah.
that occurred in the area where I lived, which got me on my first campaign, which is to protect the redwood forests.
Oh, wow. Oh, I love that. I think, I mean, trees you mentioned quite a bit in your book, which is the story is in our bones and how worldviews and climate justice can remake a world in crisis. And a lot of what you talk about initially is about worldviews, which I think perhaps some people, well, we're all probably quite guilty of not actually giving that enough attention of how we've come to the experiences and the way we experience and see ourselves and vision ourselves into the world. And and how it has actually changed. I think we sort of accept what is now as having always been. And it's really fascinating. I've loved reading your book and all of the wisdom and information that you've gathered over your life and shared from all the indigenous cultures. And one of the things that you do talk about is the tree of life, actually, isn't it? And how trees were an important part of cultural life and also significant sites. I think that for me was one of the things I really enjoyed reading in your book, was more about the history of trees alongside people.
Yeah, it's funny. The other day, someone told me, even though the book, as you know, is quite wide-ranging
Yeah.
on many, many, many topics, someone did mention to me that they also felt like underneath there was a love letter to trees and forests in the
Yeah.
book. It's funny that you mentioned that. I didn't notice that because as you know, the book has many different topics, but I think the trees do come up a lot in the
Yeah.
book. So that's interesting. Yeah, I think that, when we're getting at worldviews, I really wanted to start the book with that as a deep systemic approach to the moment that we're in. And I mention this because I am the founder and executive director of the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network. And our daily work is very hands-on, whether it's working to stop fossil fuel projects or work on reforestation and stopping deforestation, or going to high-level policy meetings to do everything we can to protect nature and really work to have different policies and many, many different activities. Um, I wanted in my book to go upstream from there
Yeah.
and give us some meaning and ways to explore how do we get into what many scholars are calling a polycrisis, whether it's social, economic, or ecological, these interlocking crises that we're now facing. And when we look at it this way, we can see that it's really the systems that we're in that have been built over time. And in that discussion, we have to look at who we are, how we see the world. What is our education? What is our code of conduct? What are the morals of our society? And that really does require a different kind of reflection. But I think it's absolutely essential, because if we don't understand our worldviews, then we will continue to perpetuate the harms that we see now, whether we are looking at racism or colonization or this extractive economy or patriarchy. All these systems that oppress people in the land won't really be resolved unless we can understand how do we think about the world and how it came into being. And so we have to look at root causes in that sense, and the root
Yeah.
causes of the problems we're looking at now. So it's a mammoth topic. I could only
Yeah.
cover some of it, but it's also something that I hope will seed conversation. It's not all neat and tidy. It's a wild ranging conversation, but I think once we look at it, it can help us. And I'll just finish my remarks by just saying, to get at like one specific point, this idea of that we live in a dead matter world, instead of seeing an animate cosmology where the
Yeah.
stones and the rivers and the forests and the trees are all alive and we're part of a living web of life, and how that worldview is extraordinarily different than seeing in the dominant culture dominion over the land. Like,
Yeah.
we are here and the land is here for our use, and there's no reciprocal relationship or need to tend and care for that relationship with nature, and that we are nature. And so just that is one example is gigantic. If you think about how we look at modern society over consumerism, the problems that we have in every sphere, the fact that we're in a climate crisis about to burn the planet where none of us will be living if
Yeah.
we make it uninhabitable, et cetera. How do we actually get to the root causes and look at the kinds of thinking that got us here? And so this is why worldview becomes so paramount.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, and I think it's something that maybe other people touch on, but not into the depth of conversation that you've done in your book, and I would highly recommend people read your book because it is really, really thought-provoking, and just, getting you to question like what you accept as norms in life, really, and just how pervasive I think this dominant cultural view, and predominantly the Western white cultural view that we're discussing here, is in just even in our language, isn't it? In everything that we approach, it's just sort of seeped in, and it really requires us to become very curious about everything around us and everything we're using. I mean, even at one point you talk about mapping, even, and how the maps that we use to view the world are actually part of shaping our world view. It's literally there is just so much, isn't there, that we have to build awareness of to understand, really, I guess, our sense of place, isn't it? That's what we're looking for, is to come and find where we are now and really understand that sense of how we've come to where we are, so that we can start having the discussions that help lead us out of this place.
Yeah, I think that there's, just to pick up a few threads, I think that one, I think that we need to understand the systems of oppression that surround us and the water that we're swimming in.
Mm.
So that would be, as we mentioned, this idea of colonization, this idea of patriarchy, white supremacy, this idea of racism. All of these things have contributed to, there being a lot of misplaced power. So we have the wealthy elite and the Western worldviews really permeating all over the world. And so it's a question of naming them, getting knowledgeable, and then being able to transform them, dismantle and transform. Or I also like to talk about composting. How do we take a lot of the systems we're in and compost them, and so that they can be transformed into healthy soil for a healthy culture? And so the work is very personal. When we look at racism, or we look at colonization, or we look at our lifestyle, it's very personal. So I think we have to be aware, especially people who are white people, aware of the discomfort of going through this journey of awareness and awakening, especially if you're part of, privileged society. And at the same time, the great joy of going through this process, because it also means there can be tremendous healing and a pathway towards a deeper understanding of who we are, what are egalitarian societies, how do we really build justice and equity into a path going forward. And often this means, looking historically into the cultures and societies that we've built in modern society, and looking at it straight in the eye, and being able to metabolize and incorporate what we see, and then really begin to imagine and create and roll up our sleeves and get engaged in the
Yeah.
world that we're working to create. So on the one hand, I see a world that is really unraveling and falling apart with all the different polycrises that we see at hand. And on the other hand, I really see so many people working towards transformation and change and solutions, and the creativity and the array of work that is going on
Yeah.
is phenomenal and so inspiring. So, like, while one world is being, you know, hospice
Dismantled. Yes.
to its end,
Yeah.
another world is calling to be brought forth.
Yeah.
And, we're in a very delicate place of terrific promise or terrific peril.
Yeah.
And we're right there on that razor's edge. And so, yeah, I really believe we need to collect together, share ideas, and really push forward with a very different agenda. But it has to come from a very deep place, or we're going to offer solutions that are at the surface level that actually don't get at the problem. So just to give you an example, if I could wave a magical wand and end colonization or end the climate crisis or environmental degradation tomorrow, poof, the fact is we wouldn't change the systems in the way we're thinking, and there would be another destructive
Yeah.
economic extractive economy that we would be developing, or we still wouldn't be egalitarian, and racism wouldn't just end even if we took care of one problem. So
Yeah.
this is why it's a time of both putting out immediate fires and doing immediate work, everything we can to support the ecological systems of life, support people who are being discriminated against, and at the same time, realize that it's going to take a long-term vision
Yeah.
and a systemic thought process to get us to where we actually need to go.
Yeah, I think that's the big thing, isn't it? And I think that's the thing that sometimes we find a bit overwhelming is this, the greater systemic change that is really required to actually like just overthrow you, I guess, this worldview that has dominated for so long, which sees really us separate from nature. I mean, that's one of the core wounds of our society, is this complete separation from nature, our dominance over it as well, and that has allowed and led to the extractivist kind of society that we live in, where we can just take from nature with no regard for the outcome and the circumstances. And it is having to completely change that, the relationship. And that's something that I'm really passionate about, is helping to people to find ways to reconnect. And I love that through your book you have spent a lot of time with Indigenous peoples, and the amazing wisdom that they have that can guide us into these practices, isn't it? It's just like we have this wealth of incredible wisdom with these people that sadly have suffered extraordinarily at the hands of our culture, our predominant culture, and yet they have this resource that can help guide us forward, as well as well, with a lot of answers to help us, isn't it?
Well, I think it's really interesting to see that 80%, which is just amazing to think about, 80% of all the biodiversity left on Earth, meaning our forests, our water, the minerals, 80% of the biodiversity is stewarded by Indigenous
Yeah.
peoples on the lands and territories. And there's a reason for that, which is, again, how they're viewing nature
Yeah.
as a relative, as alive.
Yeah.
And the most important thing is protecting the land. And so, yeah, I think it's really important that we learn from Indigenous peoples all over the world. And many of us who live in lands that have been colonized don't even know where we live and who are the Indigenous
Yeah.
peoples who still are here. They're not gone, they're still here. So, one of the practices I think we can engage in is, wherever we live, is to learn who are the Indigenous people, the original peoples of the land, and learn from them and be respectful of the fact that we're guests or settlers on their territories and lands. And how can we support their voices? How can we support their projects? How can we support their campaigns and their calls for justice, their calls for solutions, their calls for their traditional ecological knowledge to be respected and learned from? So I think there's a lot of work that can be done there to realize, like, Indigenous knowledge is a solution to a lot of our environmental problems, because of their very long-standing relationship upon the lands where they live, and practices that were unfortunately, ignored in
Yeah.
modernization, and with different concepts about the land. And one that comes to mind that I mentioned in the book that I think is really amazing, because where I live, there's a lot of forest fires, and they've gotten worse because of the climate crisis and change in the climate, but also because traditionally Indigenous people who lived on these lands had really wonderful practices where they would have controlled burns.
Yeah.
And it
Okay.
was done in a very specific way, where a lot of the underbrush was burnt. And so when the fires come through, it wouldn't be the built up tinderbox in the
Yeah.
forests, which
Yeah.
then really destroy the forest, instead of really doing it in a beautiful reciprocal way with the land and tending to the land. And these controlled burns were really beautiful because they actually help nurture health in the forest and create areas for the wildlife to come and eat and
Yeah.
feed. And understanding that humans can be life enhancing. And that's really what I'm trying to get at, instead of feeling that we're separate from nature or have dominion over nature, that we are part and particle of the web of life. And how can we see ourselves as life enhancing and reclaim our earth lineage in a healthy manner? And I think this is one of the things we're really seeking to do, is to transform the current model that we're in, which is extraction, exploitation, and taking, instead of, oh, we can be a keystone species. We can be a species that is making the land flourish. In times in the past, all across the Americas with Indigenous people here, but all over Europe. People lived in harmony with the land
Yeah.
and were constantly looking for ways to create that reciprocal relationship where life is thriving. And I think this is what we're seeking. And I would just, also add that I think also this is not just something physically we can do, it also is something deeply necessary to our well-being as human beings, because this idea of separation from nature and this feeling of orphanage from a living earth has been incredibly detrimental and does lead to over-consumerism and taking and colonization, and I believe even wars, because of this loss of this deep healing we need to feel of belonging to
Yeah.
the land, belonging to our communities, belonging to each other, and how that impacts how we live with others and with the earth. And so it's a very core transformation that I think we need to engage in, is how do we reclaim and regenerate our relationship with nature, and become life enhancing, and remember that we're part of this earth lineage and this deep belonging to the land. And without that, I think it creates a lot of violence and grief and disorientation that so many people are feeling.
Yeah, I think something that I talk to quite a few of my guests about is the concept of trauma, basically, and these wounds that we're carrying. Um, a lot of people sometimes think of trauma as things that, sort of soldiers, people who've been in sort of battles and war and horrific events suffer, which is particularly appropriate really for the climate crisis as well, because a lot of the impacts of the climate crisis do inflicts these huge traumas on disproportionately these indigenous peoples and land, I guess more land-based guardians really is for a word for them. And so but it also affects us as well in our sort of more Western privileged culture, and it is an important thing to look for healing for everyone, isn't it? And to honor everyone's practices for that. And I think that's again the conversation that you've been opening up with the indigenous peoples, and you work you do amazing work with with your organization, um supporting the indigenous voices, don't you, and really helping them at an international level to be heard and have their rights honored as they should be in protecting of their lands.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we can do is to learn more about Indigenous rights,
Yeah.
because, it's all good that we learn from Indigenous people, but it's also important that, we hear their calls to action, and one
Yeah.
is around Indigenous rights. And not to go into too wonky of a political discourse here, but, I think something that's important for people to learn about is that Indigenous peoples have unique rights, and they worked for, at least 2 decades at the United Nations level to generate the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, in addition to the fact that we all have human rights, which was
Yeah.
also the Universal Declaration on Human Rights that the UN established internationally. But Indigenous peoples really fought for their own rights as well, because they have unique rights, and they see rights as being a collective of Indigenous peoples, not like an individual human rights, but
Yeah.
that they are a collective people. And they made sure it was Indigenous peoples' rights with that S on the end,
Yeah.
and really fought for that to ensure that they had collective rights, but also within that context, a relationship with the land. And so there's something called free, prior, and informed consent. And this is the idea that Indigenous peoples have territories, and before any kind of activity occurs on their territories and traditional lands, that there has to be free, prior, and informed consent, that Indigenous peoples have the right to consent whether or not, a fossil fuel project will happen on their land, or a mining project, or a dam goes into one of their waterways. And unfortunately, those rights are violated all of the time. And so some
Yeah.
of the work that we do at a global scale, and then working with governments and financial institutions, is to support Indigenous peoples in having those rights implemented. And it's a big struggle. It's a
Yeah.
very big struggle. But it's also important to know that those rights are there, and that we can continue to really fight for them. I think this is a really key component. And then the other thing I wanted to bring up, because I think it's important to continue to look at, the problems, but also some of the solutions.
Yeah.
one of the things I'm very excited about is, work that we do around rights of nature, which I discuss in the book as well, which is one of the fastest growing Earth jurisprudence or ways of looking at Earth laws throughout the world. Even the Secretary General of the United Nations mentioned last year that it's one of the fastest growing movements in the world. And rights of nature basically is this idea that we need a very different DNA for our legal frameworks concerning nature.
Yeah.
So right now, most of us and most modern legal frameworks look at nature as property and we own nature. And again, you can see how this ties to worldviews, this idea of dominion over nature, that we
Yeah.
actually own the land, where, in pre-patriarchal and pre-colonized times, and certainly with indigenous peoples today, you don't own the land, you steward the land, you're a guest on the land. We're all relatives, the earth is alive. And so, how do we really look at the earth and get the earth in the center of the discussion and discourse right now and not see nature as a commodity?
Yeah.
And how do we get nature out of the marketplace? Because nature should not be part of the marketplace. It shouldn't be underneath the economy. The centerpiece should be nature, ecology, the planetary boundaries. And then we figure out everything from there. And Rights of Nature does this. It says, nature has rights. The river has the right to flow and be healthy, and has the right to not be interfered with, or the forest, or the mountain, and the climate. And so nature needs to have its own rights so that in a court of law it can be recognized and we can support those rights. And I think what's very exciting is that it's not just a concept. In 2008, Ecuador became the first country in the world to have rights of nature in their constitution.
Oh,
And there
wow.
have been several cases now that have been won using rights of nature legislation. Here in the United States, there's been over 36 cases at the local level of stopping fracking and other infringements to rivers, using local rights of nature laws and creating local ordinances to stop harmful projects using rights of nature and asserting that law. I'll give one more example, but there's many. There's over like 39 countries now engaged in
Oh,
using rights of
fantastic.
nature legislation. A case was just won in Spain to protect a river. Um, I was very fortunate several years ago to go to New Zealand, where a form of rights of nature is seeing uh, different parts of nature having personhood. And so in New Zealand, the Maori people there fought for over 200 years and finally got a settlement with the New Zealand government to have the Wanganui River be recognized as a living ancestor. And it's stewarded by one person from the government and someone from the Wanganui tribe. And it's really extraordinary because it sees that the Wanganui River is a living relative and cannot be harmed and maintains the same rights as a human. And
Yeah.
so nothing can harm the river that that would create a detrimental impact on the river. And when I was there on a fact-finding delegation to learn more about the implementation of this Wanganui River settlement, I was there with some really powerful Maori leaders, and one of the elders took me to the river to share a special spot on the Wanganui River. And when we were there, she sang a very beautiful song as we were watching the river. And when she was done, she took my hand and she said, "We have a saying here. I am the river, and the river is me.
Mm.
I am the river, and the river is me." And it was just such a full moment because, of course, we hear in science class that, 70 or 80% of our body is water,
Yeah.
and we hear these things, but in that moment, and her transmission to me was so powerful in that I could really feel in an embodied way how, yes, I am this river, and the river is me.
Yeah.
And this is their living ancestor and all of our ancestor, and how we're connected to all the waters of the world. And I think there's also these legal frameworks, but they also can reflect to us in a very embodied way, a very different relationship with the land. And so I'm very excited about this rights of nature work
Yeah.
because it's a legal framework, but it's also a way we can shift culture and our experience of the land by thinking very differently. And so, yeah, I wanted just to bring up that
No, I
example.
love that. I think quite often um the news that's shared by the mainstream media about the climate conferences, the international sort of organizations, and the movement to sort of to make the changes and things is slowly grinding. And I think we don't often hear that actually some positive steps have happened already. And I think, and like, that is the first step. You need that legal framework. Then you need to have people like your organization that help people challenge that and hold corporations and countries and governments to that framework, don't they? And that's I guess sort of the step that you're in now, is actually saying, okay, we've worked really hard, it's taken us a long time, and we've got some of this framework in place. Now we need to see it implemented. But it is, we do just need to see nature in this way, and to realize that anything that we do to her, we do to ourselves, and we're not separate. And the poisoning of the land, the poisoning of the rivers is poisoning of ourselves. And we're seeing that in our societies and our cultures, the increase of illnesses and disease and everything else. And I guess that, and also the sort of the more mental diseases as well, of the mental impacts of our predominant culture and our disconnect from nature. So it is just encouraging to hear that actually there is this legal framework, and there is something that we can work with and step into. And I love that is the solution orientated bit is something that you're really passionate about. Your book goes on to, in the later stages, talking about some of the amazing achievements that have happened. I mean, they haven't come easily. They've been hard fought for a lot of people who have been incredibly brave, standing up for their beliefs and offering us all the hope by basically putting themselves on the front line. But actually it is incredible. And some of the work you do, I mean, I don't know if you talk about a couple of your projects, but one of them is the Women for the Forest program, because we've talked about trees, so I think it would be a lovely one. But you guys are doing some incredible work with that, and I wondered if you'd like to share that, so that perhaps people could go and learn a little bit more about you, if they were interested in what you're doing and what you're achieving, which is already tangible.
Thank you. Thank you for that offering of being able to share some of that. Yes, one of the areas at the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, or WECAN, which is our acronym, WECAN, so you don't have to say that big long sentence every time, is working with forests. And I'll mention a few of the projects just so people can have a sense of the work there. We've been working for 9 years now in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which, just to note, is one of the most violent regions in the world right now, because of the extractive economy, because of racism and colonization. And so right now, in the race to renewable energy, there are a lot of critical minerals under the ground in the DR Congo, which most people who live there do not benefit from. Other countries come in, or the government itself, to do the extraction and then selling off of those minerals. Again, and the local communities not benefiting from that. So that's one problem.
And they suffer as well, sadly. They are exploited themselves as much as their land, and their forests are exploited. Yeah.
So then there also creates a lot of conflicts and, a lot of violence and conflicts over those resources. Yes, the people are completely exploited because of these activities. So just to say, this is a context, and it particularly impacts women even more due to sexual and gender violence that always gets tied into conflict and danger for women. So, there's a lot of problems in the DR Congo. At the same time, it's a region that we feel needs a lot of our attention, to also, help diminish the impacts of conflict. And, but, again, it requires a systemic approach to understanding why we are having this extraction in the first place. And I'll get to the trees in a minute, but I just wanted to say, I think when we look at the renewable energy transition we're in and getting off of fossil fuels, one of the things we must take into account is something called the just transition, meaning that who benefits from the transition. And we cannot just carry over the extractive model that we have now with, this hyper individualized capitalism structure where the wealthy elite continue to benefit above everyone
They've
else.
just switched from fossil fuel to whatever
renewables. This is not going to work. It won't work. So I'll just leave it at that. But the project we've been doing, we have now over 1,000 amazing women in the DR Congo who are reforesting this area called the Otombe rainforest in the eastern Congo area in the DRC. And what's very exciting is that 25% of the trees are for human use for the communities, and 75% are there to rewild lands that were completely demolished through slash and burn techniques. And I mean, I'm talking no green, nothing there. And now what is very exciting is, 9 years in, we've grown a lot of trees, hundreds and thousands of trees, and enough that we're almost to the point or getting close to the point where 1.6 million acres of old growth natural forest can be protected, and communities don't need to go into the forest to get their daily needs.
Firewood and
their firewood, different and foods and medicines. They can really protect that old growth forest and not be using it for their housing and their firewood. And they can use the trees that we're growing. And then the 25% of the trees are growing, and then we're rewilding the damaged land with 75% of the trees. And many different things have happened. One, there's a law in the DR Congo that if you take damaged land and you start planting there and growing things and stewarding that land, you can have ownership of it. Oh, wow. So in a society that is quite patriarchal and difficult for women, women are becoming landowners, which is giving them power in their communities. They also are growing lots of food trees in their 25% trees that they're growing. And so, they're creating economy, they're creating food. We also have a food sovereignty part of the program where we're feeding communities who are in conflict zones. And then something new happened as of about a year and a half ago, which we did not expect. And different foresters I've talked to and scientists have said they didn't know either it would happen that quickly. But because of all the trees that we're growing, it brings tremendous moisture to the land and calls more moisture to the land. And so now there are what we're calling wild nurseries, areas that we don't have, that we didn't grow the nurseries, but they are reestablishing themselves, different pockets of the land that are rewilding all by themselves because of the rains returning. And of course, that's the best because nature knows best which plants go with who and what the trees like and how to create, regenerate a natural forest. And so it's really thrilling because, again, this idea of humans being life enhancing and how if we step in, how fast the earth can regenerate herself is something I think we don't know everything about. And so, again, one of the scientists I talked to thought it would be like 40 years. Well, it happened in 9 years.
Wow.
At the beginning of this process. So it's very exciting. And then I'll just share one other project that we just started that I'm really excited about. We've worked for many years in the Amazon rainforest, particularly in Brazil and Ecuador. And one of our close partners, Patricia Golinga, is our coordinator there. And I would like to also mention Nima Namandu, who is our coordinator in the DR Congo. These are amazing, powerful women.
Powerhouses, aren't they? They're incredible.
Out from the story because they are incredible leaders who are the coordinators of these tremendous projects. And one of the things that we learned about the Ecuadorian Amazon and how some of the species in the Ceriaco territory are going extinct. And some of this is because of mining and fossil fuel extraction. And some of it is because of the climate change, the changing climate. And so this project, which we've just started, involves women in the region going out into very, it's already remote, it's in the jungle, but even more remote areas and collecting the seeds of these trees that are going extinct. And we're creating nurseries to regenerate these trees and grow them and to ensure that there's ecological integrity in the Amazon rainforest for its own survival. And it has, a lot of these trees have cultural, spiritual, as well as ecological import. And so again, this idea that we've done a lot of harm, but how do we step in to transform, the ecological systems? And I think regeneration work is absolutely essential while we fight off a lot of bad stuff. I mean, they both have to happen at the same time. And we go to the UN climate talks every year, and bring, frontline women to go advocate for themselves. We do a lot of advocacy work and trying to stop bad projects. But I think we have to do both. While we're
Yeah.
stopping bad, so to speak, we also have to build the
Yeah.
good and do everything we can to protect nature and regenerate ecological systems because of all the harms that have occurred. And also, just to add, also support the local communities who should not be suffering. Those who've done
Yeah.
the least to harm the world should not be the ones suffering the most. And
Yeah.
our systems are perpetuate that.
Yeah, I was just gonna raise that point and just say what I really love about your approach is you're bringing women into the heart of it, which is very important for you, and perhaps we'll touch on that quickly. But it's just I don't, you're empowering the local people, which I think is really key. Like you're giving them the opportunity to feel this custodianship and pride for their own lands, which is really important. Rather than sometimes I think conservation has that sort of parachute effect and come in, tell people what they need to do and sort of dictate and not actually care for the people and the community. And that's the other thing I was going to say is I love the fact that it is just benefiting the community in all of these myriad interconnected ways, which of course is the way nature works, isn't it? But it's just, to give them food security. I mean, I've spent a lot of time in Africa, so I've seen these areas where they have cleared forests and trees. They need the wood for numerous reasons, and then they try to grow crops, and the soils degrade and they're struggling and they're always sort of on the back foot. So to hear this amazing story of how it started with a tree nursery, but it's also got the benefits of providing food, empowering the women, giving them an opportunity to have more of a voice in their local communities as well as on like a more national, international stage, is really important, because food sovereignty is another aspect of what you do, and it's perhaps a term that is only just really gaining momentum, I think. It's more in more recent years, this idea of food sovereignty, but it really is important for a lot of cultures actually, and is can have a huge impact on climate change by basically supporting this idea of food sovereignty, can't it?
Yeah, food sovereignty is huge. Food security is a huge thing. It will become even more so. And it's a very big topic, but just to touch on a few things, I mean, you know, the fact that we ship food all over the world is part of the climate crisis,
Yeah.
just that alone, and our food systems. Then there's the fact that big agribusiness is based on fossil fuels and all of the different pesticides and chemicals used in the process of big industrial agriculture. And the list goes on about, how the food industry and the way that we grow food and the current large agricultural businesses are part of the climate crisis. And the fact that even United Nations studies show that it is far better to have local organic farming as a way to feed people that is good for local communities and is good for the overall environment and the climate. And yet, again, because of capitalism and the way that we see corporations running the world and the fact that they need to be challenged, and we need to assert our power to do so as communities and
Yeah.
the global community, it's very difficult to make these transformations. But study after study shows that this is the way we should be feeding people, is through local farming, local organic farming, and there's so many different names for that, whether we want to call it permaculture, organic farming, traditional ecological knowledge. I do think there's, again, a lot to learn from Indigenous peoples about their practices of farming the land. So that's a whole body of work. But context to your question as well, everyone is going to need to think about this as we
Yeah.
go. Where is our food coming from? How do we create local food sheds? Everyone getting more engaged in their own gardening. I mean, many of us who don't live in a drought-stricken area, or are not in a community that is marginalized, we just go to the store and buy our food, and most people don't think about it. But it's something in the years to come we're all going to need to be thinking about. much, much more. And so people having food sovereignty and food security is absolutely essential. And so, yeah, it's a big part of our programming so that people can also deal with the impacts of the climate crisis in their communities. So I'm talking about Indigenous peoples, Black and Brown communities, people in the global South, need support to generate these local food programs.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's very important. And you had, touched upon women, and we're the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network for a reason,
Yeah.
which is that, one of the untold stories about the climate crisis is the fact of how, due to gender inequality, women around the world are impacted first and worse, along with, marginalized communities. And so, there's many places where women don't have mobility, are not empowered to even have a car. They're taking care of their families. In crises, a lot of times women are harmed first and worst because they won't leave their families alone. They're tending to their children or
Yeah.
elderly and get caught up in a flood, as an example. So there's many reasons that because of gender inequality, women are impacted more than others. But at the same time, what we formed our organization on when I first got into climate work is doing a lot of research and seeing that women are essential to solutions and that you actually can't get to solutions without the engagement of women.
Yeah.
Whether it's growing food, because women are deeply engaged, between 40 and 80% of all household food production in the global South is done by women. Water programs depend completely on women. And at the highest levels of government, it is also the case. I'll just give one statistic so people can to understand a little bit more about this, which is that there's something called the Women's Political Empowerment Index, and every country is evaluated on this index. And it basically shows, are women involved in social practices? Are they running for office? What kind of agency do they have? What kind of
Yeah.
economy do they have in a country? And a study has shown that that with just a 1 unit increase in the Women's Political Empowerment Index, whichever country you're looking at, it leads to an 11.51% decrease in carbon emissions,
Wow.
which is huge.
Yeah,
And,
it's just
and not that everything's about carbon emission reductions, it's just to show how much power women have.
yeah.
Or if people want to look at an example we just saw at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, countries that were led by women did far better with their populations than countries led by men.
Yeah.
And it's not about putting men down. It's about lifting women up and understanding their critical role in global affairs at this stage. And we need to realize that gender is a component and
Yeah.
that we need to look at it.
Yeah, and then it comes back to where we started with the worldview, doesn't it? And the patriarchy, and basically the fact that the feminine, which is is present in all of us, in men and women. Both of us have aspects of masculine and feminine, and that the feminine has been suppressed in everyone, in men as well as women, and actually just helping to give more voice to women and to raise the feminine is just absolutely key in bringing balance back, isn't it, really? Because that's what we need in the world, is this balance of all of these people that have been marginalized, whether that's women, whether it's the indigenous peoples, people who've suffered from racism, colonialism. We need all of them to bring their unique wisdom, their voices, their knowledge to the table, so that we can we can move forward and vision this way out of this, the problems that we're finding ourselves in.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that, this is why, naming these different isms are so important
Yeah.
that we've been talking about throughout this podcast, including, the way that we look at women and men, but also I would say getting out of binaries as well. Everyone across the gender spectrum, and realizing we're all are sentient beings.
Yeah.
We all have the same rights, and we need to really generate egalitarian societies. And that means lifting up the feminine at this point, and realizing that we're out of balance and we need balance. And that, to have a bird fly strong, you can't have one wing. You have to have both wings to
Yeah.
fly. And
Yeah.
that's a stage we're in right now. And I also wanted just to mention something, since you're UK based, along this line, which I get into in the book, is Of course, I'm mainly focusing on Indigenous peoples today, intact Indigenous peoples today, which is very distinct and where we should put all of our focus.
Yeah.
But also, we need to do so much healing work as white people or from the dominant culture who have really broken those trails to our own Indigenous roots. And I think this is also a part of the healing process, is the historical reflection on our pre-patriarchal and pre-colonized ancestors, which might seem very abstract, but for me is actually a political decision and is part of our advocacy, because I don't think we're going to come from a deep enough place or be able to create the kind of healing necessary to act differently, to have different politics,
Yeah.
to have different social structures, unless this deep healing of the trauma we talked about is addressed. And part of it is understanding when we all came from harmonized relationships with the land. Nothing perfect, not some utopias in the past,
Yeah.
but a basic understanding of the balance of the female male, the balances of the goddesses and gods, if you will. And when you look at Europe and you look at the UK, but all across Europe, you see these beautiful ancient stone wheels, or you have Stonehenge, like to not look at those as just historical artifacts or architecture, but to realize, oh, we all come from a people that understood the cycles of the seasons, that understood the life-enhancing nature of our presence, and that respect for the ecology and the ecosystems we live within. And so I think part of this is also this deep need to trace our ancestries and to reclaim them and regenerate those practices and understandings so we can remember who we are in this earth
Yeah.
lineage as not separate from the land. So I think this is all part of the feminine rising, the part of regenerating an understanding of an animate living earth. And this is all part of the transformation we're in, that is also part of a political agenda as well, because we're not divided up into these neat categories. We are holistic beings, whether we choose to remember that or not. And so we all need to address all of these things to be holistic.
Yeah, I love that. I think it is very hard. I mean, I'm from the UK, but I've spent a lot of time in Africa, and it's I found it harder in the UK to try and, find that sort of indigenous knowledge base and root structure here, because there isn't anything that's as obviously tangible as there are in other parts of the world where the indigenous peoples have managed to survive and hold their cultures intact to a degree. I mean, obviously they've been massively compromised, but they still have um their stories, and they're able to tell that. And one of the things that you did talk quite a lot about in your book, which actually was quite personal to me, was about women and witches as well, and the suppression of women throughout Europe through the witch trials, the witch hunts that happened. And actually, it's quite where I live, the nearby village, we had has a link to actually the last woman in the UK who was tried and sort of convicted of being a witch. She was the last person in the UK, but actually she was then pardoned, and so she wasn't actually put to death. But that is a huge wound, I think, for women, particularly um, in our part of the world, and it has had a lasting impact on our psyche, hasn't it? And I mean, this is your book is called "The Story Is in the Bones," um, and it is, isn't it? It's about what's held in our DNA. And I mean, a lot of the trauma work that I do, there's a fantastic book called The Body Keeps the Score by Gabor Mate. And it is about the fact that your tissues and your body holds on to trauma, and it can be generational. And I think a lot of women perhaps don't realize that, when they struggle to raise their voice, when they struggle to sort of stand behind their beliefs and what they're passionate about, and they're afraid of standing out from the crowd and being judged, a lot of this is this generational trauma from the suffering we experienced during that awful, well, it was an extended period. I think it was over about 400 years, wasn't it? So it was quite a prolonged period of basically being afraid to show who you were for fear of being persecuted for it.
Absolutely. I think one of the reasons I brought it up in the book is I really think that part of healing means also understanding the historical context. And so you can have these feelings or traumas that you're unaware of, and then you live them out. And, it's sort of like when you go to the doctor, you need to get a diagnosis and then you can treat. And we're culturally sort of in that situation right now where we need to name these things that have traumatized us or have come out as cultural patterns so that we can transform them. If we can't name them and see them, we can't heal them. And so this is why it's very critical, everything that you're saying and how it's impacted women and men as well. And then on top of that, to realize that that has supported the patriarchal project. It continues it because not only are we having this trauma that we've carried from, the witch burnings and other harms, earlier that set the stage for the witch burnings, but then again we have, this acceptance of men being more important than women, just to put it simply, or men being more important than any other gender, and so I think it's really important to name these things so that we can begin to unpack them and transform them. But yes, I think it was really amazing for me to do that research and then see how it not only impacted Europe, but was also that mentality was brought to the Americas as well. And there continues to be witch burnings, as I mentioned in the book, in other parts of the world. But it is part of the patriarchal project that has been going on for thousands of years that culminated in something as horrific as the witch burnings. And so I think that we still have not addressed that. It is not taught, it is not discussed. I mean, people vaguely heard about it and it just seems like some bizarre thing that happened in the past, but it's not attached to anything in part in terms of our current moment and our current context. And that disconnect is not going to help us further where we need to go to build egalitarian and healthy societies. And so yeah, I think it's really important that we continue to discuss these things and to have them be in our history books, that they're taught, that we realize what is going on. And here in the United States, it's so key that we talk about, how this country was built on colonization and the genocide of Indigenous peoples, and on the backs of, the racism and slavery of Black people. Like, it's insane to not name those things and talk about the current violence that is happening here in the United States of America and how that's impacted everyone, or this issue of the witch burning. So all of these things are really uncomfortable to talk about, but they also can free us into creating a different context. As they say, the truth will set you free. And I think we need to understand, no matter how difficult it is to discuss these things, that it will lead to an enormous amount of freedom, liberation for everyone, both the land and people, and lead us to a much better society.
Yeah, I think it's really important because I think a lot of a lot of people who are connected to the earth in a greater sense than perhaps, the main part of society are people who would probably historically have been called witches because, they're people who would be looking to the plants for perhaps herbal medicine or, just feeling more connected to nature, aware of the more animacy of the world around them. And so I think it is definitely a very important wound for us to bring awareness to and to, heal together collectively. But I think one of the things that gives me a lot of hope, because it is a very heavy discussion, some of the things that we've been talking about, but one of the things that gives me hope is the fact that you state that, like, the worldviews that we have now aren't the worldviews we've always had. And actually, therefore, we can rewrite this story. Like, we have a current story, but that wasn't our past story, and it doesn't need to be our future story. And I think that's quite an empowering place, actually, for us to sit in as we face some of these difficult pasts that we have to look to and understand and heal to be able to move forward.
Absolutely. That's the thing. We have choice.
Yeah.
We have choice. That's a gift that we have as human beings. We have choice. And so we're at this critical moment, as I mentioned earlier in our conversation, this tremendous choice point that we all need to really sit with of, path of promise or path of peril. And,
Yeah.
that's a very oversimplified way of saying it, but, this is why I also open my book with a conversation about time, and how on the one hand, we really need to slow down to really be able to think these things through, be slow enough to grow our own food, slow enough to appreciate nature outside our, houses, wherever we live in the
Yeah.
city or in the countryside, wherever we are, and slow down and remember who we are in a relationship with nature and each other. And at the same time, the climate crisis, environmental degradation, the violence of the world is not slowing down. And so we have to act fiercely, quickly, and compassionately. And so I find myself every day in the stance about time, to
Yeah.
make sure I have time to be quiet and still and go deep. And at the same time, there are crises all around me. I mean, my phone here is a hotline for, women land defenders who are under attack and threatened for protecting the
Yeah.
forest, and they need help
Yeah.
today. And all of these conferences that come up where we can intervene with different ideas. So there is a time crunch, and the youth are on the streets for a really good reason, and we need
Yeah.
to respond. But we also need to think through where we're coming from. And so it's a dance between moving quickly and slowly all at once. And I just call it like a sacred time riddle.
Yeah.
And that we have to relax into that, because that is the state of what trauma brings about. And yeah, so I just really want to support people in thinking through how to work collectively with one another, not to be alone. We can only do this work in community, that we find people who are like-minded and like-hearted that we can be with to do this work, whether it's personal work or our work in the world, and that it's time for all of us to roll up our sleeves. Really, we can't be on the sidelines. It's a time where we all need to engage. And there's so many ways to engage. Whatever you're passionate about, engage in it, because this is the work at hand. It's the great task of our time. And we're all part of it. We're at a time in history that is phenomenal. And I think the more we get excited about what we can do in our choices, and the solutions that are there, that will give us the strength to go through it.
Yeah, I love that, Osprey. Thank you so much. I would highly encourage everyone to go and pick up a copy of your amazing book, The Story is in Our Bones, and read that, because it will just give you so much thought and curiosity for how you can move forward. But we're sort of getting at the point to round up, and I would like to just invite you, if you would offer to share how people maybe who've been interested by what you do, how they could perhaps find ways to support you and some of the incredible initiatives that you are undertaking, because I know I've found them hugely inspiring, and it is not always easy to find things that you can support, and whether they can donate to you, or if there's other ways that they could get involved to support you, and we can, and some of the amazing projects, like some of the ones we mentioned in the DR Congo, and the food sovereignty, and things like that.
Well, thank you so much for asking. People are welcome to go to our website at www.wecan, we can, and then the word international spelled out.org. So wecaninternational.org. And there you can learn about our programs. There's lots of really interesting short videos we've produced. And we put on events. We do online events as well as in-person events. So definitely people can participate in upcoming events by going there to see when we're doing them. And we often live stream, whether we're doing a direct action to stop a project, or when we're at the United Nations, we often live stream our events so people can engage and learn more and hear from women leaders from all over the world who are doing
Oh,
amazing things.
amazing.
Um, so yeah, going to our website for information. Of course, we're very happy to accept donations. And the other thing I would mention is that there's something called Women Speak, which is an online database we've created, that has a link on our website that can take you to thousands of stories by and about women leaders and what they're doing. Yeah, so that is what I would suggest to people, and also to sign up for our newsletter, because we put them out, maybe once a month, but they're really jam-packed with
Yeah.
information and an analysis as well of how to view the current times. So yeah, anyways,
Yeah.
it's been such a pleasure to be here with you and have such a great, deep and
Oh,
wonderful conversation.
No, it's been my pleasure, and I will, to make it easy for everyone, all of your links will be in the podcast show notes and description, on all the podcast players as well, so they can can easily find you as well. They don't have to remember the link if they're perhaps driving or something and haven't been able to write it down. But yeah, it's been such a pleasure talking to you today, Osprey. I've loved reading your book. It was very moving. I know there's quite a few occasions where it moved me to tears, and it was just yeah, just from your heart, an offering to the world to understand how we've come to where we are, but also to give hope as to how we can move forward and we can vision a better future for everyone. That just, yeah, is what I think we all want, and we just are struggling to find the ways to do it. So to get in touch with your We Can as well, and to see some of the amazing work you do there is deeply inspiring as well. So thank you for everything that you are doing in the world to assist, well, all of the marginalized people, because it's indigenous peoples, it's women, it's people around the world who are affected deeply by the climate crisis, and giving us all hope for the future. So thank you for everything, and it's been my absolute pleasure to connect with you today.
Thank you so much. An honor to be on your program, and thank you for creating this space to have these kinds of conversations. They're important. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Nurtured by Nature podcast. I truly hope this conversation has brought some hope and inspiration into your life. I would love to have these messages ripple out across the world. So if you can, please share this episode with your friends, leave a review on your favourite podcast player, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. I would love to hear from you, so please feel free to connect with me on the links provided in the podcast description. But most importantly, thank you so much for being a part of this journey with me. But don't forget to simply get out there and enjoy the natural world.